Welcome to Cooking with Chef Don, our first installment of a series that we plan on running here at Buff State. Today we're going to do some local seasonal vegetables. We're going to put together in a compote type of finish, and then we're going to put them inside of crepes. We're going to do two different kinds of crepes today. One a vegan crepe batter, and the other one the traditional style crepe batter today, so that we can appeal to everyone. Being a vegan is becoming more and more popular today for varying reasons. So as chefs, we need to make sure that we're appealing to all of our public when we're making our menus and deciding on what foods we're going to serve. Part of what we teach here at Buff State follows along those lines. It's not just about what you want, it's about what your customers want and your guests want. So that's a little bit about why we're going to do that today. All of our vegetables that we're going to use are local. Farms that we're using today include Eden Valley, Miller Farms, Bowman Farms, Goodman, and Hiller. All local farms that are providing the produce to our purveyor, which is Desiderios, and they do a very good job in working with local farms to make sure that they're getting as much produce from right here in Western New York as possible. So everything that you see today, including the purple cauliflower, is local. All right. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go through the process of making the crepes, the crepe batter themselves. It is a little bit tricky when you're making a crepe batter, not quite like a pancake, because the batter needs to be very smooth. So when you're putting together your batter, there's some steps that you need to make sure you take. You don't just kind of throw it all in one bowl and mix. So what we're going to start out with is going to be the vegan crepe. So we're going to use soy milk, soybean oil, flour, pure cane sugar, brown sugar, and water, and a little bit of maple syrup, and that's it. So there's no egg product, no dairy, obviously, to keep it vegan. One of the things that I do when I'm making crepes is I sift the flour. And sometimes people think you sift ingredients together because you're trying to get out lumps of flour. That's not really what we're doing. What we're actually doing is, first of all, incorporating other ingredients. Usually it's not just the flour itself. You're adding salt, sometimes sugar, sometimes baking soda, not today, but other dry ingredients. So it's evenly dispersing it. So that's one of the reasons that we do it. The other reason would be because it incorporates some air, which adds to a nice finished texture, either light and fluffy in the case of a crepe, or even a little bit, in the case of a cake, a little bit more kind of higher texture. It creates a little bit of leavening is what it does. So at home, I'm sure most people have a strainer, okay? And this is really the best thing that you can use to sift. I'm sure they sell sifters, the little little handles with a container, and you kind of squeeze it, and it has a blade that pushes it through. Kind of takes a lot of time. They don't hold up really well. So honestly, in professional kitchens, most of the time we use strainers like this as well. So what I have here is my flour and my salt already mixed together. So to sift it, I just pop it right in there. And when I shake it a little bit, it comes right through. And you can see the difference if you look at what's in the strainer itself and what's in the bowl. You can see the difference in consistency from the flours. Okay. And you can give it a little hand at the end if you need a little help getting it through. But again, you can see quite a bit of difference in the texture. And all that was, again, is salt and flour. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take my soy milk, my water, my maple syrup, and my sugar, and I'm going to mix that together and then incorporate my flour. And soy milk is readily available nowadays. Matter of fact, there's many different versions of soy milk, sweetened, unsweetened, different flavorings added to it. So your personal preference works just fine. This is just plain soy milk. I didn't want any extra sweetness added to it because we're going to put our own in here. Again, nice natural sugar that hasn't been bleached or processed down at all. It's just in its natural form. So then I'm going to take a whisk and just whisk my ingredients together simply to get the sugars to dissolve. That's really all I'm looking for. Okay. Now I'm going to add my flour to my liquid ingredients, and I'm going to do that all at once. The reason for that is because flour contains something called gluten or glutenin. All right. And in some cases, when I'm making bread, that's a good thing. I want to develop gluten. However, when I am making crepes or cakes, pastry, I don't want a whole lot of gluten development. So the quicker I can mix this together, the better off I am, because as soon as liquid comes in contact with the flour, you begin to develop the gluten. So when you're making pancakes at home, even when you use the box mix, and they tell you only to mix briefly until it's incorporated, that's why. It's because you're going to start to develop the gluten. Again, as soon as liquid comes in contact with the flour, you do that. So once I have that incorporated, that's all I'm going to do. All right. What kind of flour do I use? In this case, it's all-purpose, and I do have recipes available for everyone. But it's all-purpose flour, and that simply means it's kind of in the middle of the road when it comes to gluten. Bread flour has the higher gluten content. Pastry flour or cake flour, two different names for the same thing, have the least amount of gluten, and all-purpose is in the middle. So sometimes with crepes, recipes will call for half cake flour, half bread flour. That kind of defeats the purpose. I think all-purpose flour can substitute for that, really. But you don't want it. What you don't want to do is, if the recipe calls for cake flour, necessarily all-purpose flour isn't always the best. But this recipe is designed to be used with the all-purpose flour. All right. The only other ingredient I have left here is my soybean oil. So I'm going to add that in a little bit of a stream as I'm whisking. And for those of you that cook a lot and know what an emulsion is, that's not really what I'm doing here. I'm not trying to create any kind of an emulsion, but it's just that if I add the fat too quickly, it doesn't tend to incorporate well, so it's kind of along the lines of an emulsion, but not quite. It's a lot easier to do. All right, so then you can see the batter when it's finished is very smooth. All right. Now the trick with crepe batter is that it needs to rest as well. So when you're going to make your crepes, you need to plan ahead a little bit and make sure that it has at least 2 hours to sit and rest. Ideally, you can do it overnight and let it sit in the refrigerator for 24 hours. You don't want it to sit too much longer than that because it will start to break down. So we're going to magically take this batter and make it go away. And we'll refrigerate that for a later use. And I'll take out a small portion here of the batter that I made earlier today, the exact same process. And you can see the texture and the color that it has. It's very runny, and that's how it's supposed to be. Again, it's not a pancake batter, it's a crepe batter. So it's meant to be extremely runny. So we'll leave that for a second, and then I'll go to the traditional crepe batter, and then we can compare kind of the color and texture that the two have, because they are certainly different. The flavor, finished flavor and texture is also different, but they're both very tasty. All right, so the process for making the traditional crepe batter is pretty similar. I'm still going to sift my flour with my dry ingredients. I'm still going to make sure that my finished texture is very liquidy, but in this case, I'm using regular milk and I'm using egg. So I'm going to start with the, again, flour. In this case, I'm using the sugar, and I'm going to sift that right in together with it. I'm using regular white sugar as opposed to the all natural. And I'm going to sift that just like I did the other one. So the texture here is going to be exactly the same. Really no difference because in the vegan crepe batter, I did not add the brown sugar, the natural sugar at this step. I dissolved it in my liquid instead. So you can see the texture here is the same as what we had in the previous batter. All right. Now what I've done is I have my egg that I've whisked together, and I've taken a little bit of the milk and added that to this part of the egg because what I'm going to do here is make more of a paste to begin with before I add the remaining liquid that I have, which is some more milk and what's called clarified butter. Clarified butter is simply when you melt whole butter and it separates into 3 different parts. At the top, you're going to have a foam, kind of white foamy material that you have. Those are the milk solids, and you skim those off. In the middle, you're going to have the oil, which is what this is. Okay? That's what we want to use. And at the very bottom, you'll have a little bit of water impurities. Kind of looks like a cloud if you've ever melted butter in a pot. And you can kind of see that cloudiness at the bottom. Those are the water and impurities. So what I want to use is what's in the middle, which is a majority of the butter. It's about 70% of the butter is that oil. And the reason that I do this is a couple of things. When I'm cooking, it can increase the flash and smoke point so it doesn't burn as quickly. Butter burns more fast than other oils do. And in the case of a crepe batter, it helps keep the batter smooth so I don't get that coagulation when I'm mixing it with the dry ingredients. So I'm just going to grab another whisk here. And I'm going to take my egg. Again, there's a little bit of the milk, about 2 of the 8 ounces of milk I added in with the egg. And that's whole egg, yolk and white. And when I mix it together, again, it's going to be a paste. All right, so this isn't going to be nice and smooth yet. And the reason behind this is kind of the same reason that we use a roux. If anybody's ever cooked with a roux before, a thickening agent, flour and fat. And that's so if I do it this way, I'm going to eliminate the chance for lumps as opposed to if I put all the liquid in at once. I have more chance of that. Okay, so once I have that paste, I'm going to take the rest of my milk and add that in. And again, start to whisk. And now it'll start to thin out and look more like the other batter. And again, mixing wise, as little as possible, just to get that nice and smooth and incorporated. And making that paste first also helps with that. By making that paste, it helps eliminate the chance, not only for lumps, but also, again, reduces my need to mix too much. All right, so nice and smooth there. Then I'm going to take my butter, and the only thing here, sometimes when we melt butter, we tend to use it immediately. It's still hot. We don't want to do that because we do have egg in here, so that would cook the egg. So while this butter is melted, it's also been brought back down. I've let it sit for a few minutes, so it's really more room temperature. Hasn't had a chance to re-solidify, but at the same time, it's not hot enough to cook the egg. All right, and once we're done there, again, you can see the smoothness of the batter, okay, and no little pieces of egg. If you're making this at home and you get a little bit of solidification of the egg, little clumps of flour or something, you could strain this out as well when you're finished making it. Pour it through a sifter just like I did for the flour and strain it out a little bit, push it through with a whisk, and that would take care of any problem because you really do not want to have lumps in your batter. Again, crepes are very thin, so any lumps are really going to affect your finished product. Okay, so again, we're going to take this and put it away. And voila, bring out our already made batter. Okay. And you can see here that the texture is a bit different from our vegan version, and the color certainly is a bit whiter. Okay. That's due to the lack of butter, for one, and the soybean milk, a little paler in color. Okay. So those are our 2 batters. Vegan and traditional. So I'm going to cook those in a second. I'm going to turn my stove on here. We're using our state-of-the-art infrared conduction cooking. So it heats up pretty quickly. Not quite the same as when you have the flame at home, although some stoves at home already have the induction burners on top as well. So that's what we're working with today. I'm going to heat these up, and then while this is starting to cook, we're going to talk a little bit about the filling that I made for the different crepes. All right, so I mentioned at the beginning all local vegetables, and then what I did was I basically turned the vegetables into compotes. Just kind of the mixing together of your ingredients. You cook it down a little bit. So what I started with was some eggplant. I have some of the cauliflower, regular cauliflower here, the butternut and acorn squash. All right, so that's the raw ingredient. Once I cooked it all together, this is what we end up with. Okay, so it's soft enough in texture that when we put it in the crepe, it's not going to, kind of not play well with the crepe itself, but not so much mushiness to it that it's going to fall apart. Okay, so we turned this into that. Our other crepe we have is going to be the golden beets, red beets, spinach, and some shallot. So those are our raw ingredients here. The beets were peeled first, then I boiled them off before drying them out in the oven. And then we turned that into this. Okay. So we diced up the different beets, sauteed it again after it came out of the oven. Again, I boiled the beets first, put them in the oven just to dry them out so you don't have so much liquid left. I don't want my compote to have too much runniness to it. So I dried them out, sauteed some shallot, the beets, and spinach together, and that was our finished compote there. Okay. Let's see if we got a decent amount of heat here. When you're making your crepes, you do want to make sure that you have enough heat that the batter is going to be able to set fairly quickly. For the traditional crepe, I have clarified butter, some more clarified butter that I'm using to cook it in. For the vegan crepe, we're going with some more soybean oil. But the key, again, is to make sure that we have enough oil in the bottom of the pan, whether it's the butter or the soybean, so that it coats the bottom of the pan. And these are regular non-stick saute pans that I'm sure most of you have at home. This here is a traditional crepe pan. All right, and the only reason I'm not going to use that one today is because this does not react with the induction burner. So if I had a flame gas top burner, I could use this. But you can see it's a little bit thinner than a traditional saute pan. The sides aren't very high. What you do is you do something called seasoning the pan when you first get it. And that simply means you're going to put some oil or butter, depending on your preference. And you're going to just cook it in there, and that's going to create a seal on the pan that stays there forever. That pan would never be washed as far as in a dishwasher or scrubbed with soap and water. It's just wiped out with a dry towel to keep that seal intact. But again, the only reason we're not going to do that today is because we don't have the flame burner. Here we have the induction burner, so traditional nonstick pans work just as well, and you don't have to worry about seasoning them. So we're gonna see if we're hot enough here. It's always good to do a little test. And this is the traditional batter here. You want to make sure you get a little sizzle. Not quite. Okay. Turn it up a little bit more. And give that a chance. What you don't want to do is put it into a pan that's not hot enough. Then it begins to set, but it doesn't set quickly enough, and that will affect the finished texture. All right, so getting that pan to the right temperature is really one of the tricks when you're making crepes. Now I'm starting to get a little sizzle here. So I'm going to add my batter. And I want just enough to coat the bottom of that pan. Okay. So you swirl it around, just enough to cover the bottom. It shouldn't be really thick at all. And we're going to let that start to cook. Then I have my vegan batter, which we're going to put on the back. Same process here, no difference. It spreads fairly similarly, although I've found that the vegan crepe batter doesn't quite spread out as much as the traditional batter does. You can try to give it a little help with your spoon or a ladle, but it's going to be slightly different than the traditional one. All right, once you start cooking, you'll see it loosens up, comes away from the pan really easily. And what we're looking for is just a little bit of browning on each side before we want to flip them. You don't want to keep going back and forth. You really want to only flip once. So you want to finish that side all the way before you flip it. And that's the same for pancakes too. The more you flip them around, the more you're changing the texture, and it doesn't turn out in the ideal manner. Okay? And you'll see the edges start to brown a tad around the top of the pan. That's how you know you're ready. You'll also see that it dries out completely on top. There's no more liquid there. I'll give it a flip. And you see we have a little bit of browning. We don't want too much. And again, these ones are going to go back in the oven as well once I roll them up. Okay, so we have a little browning there. Now we're really starting to cook here. I'm going to bring it down just a bit. All right, so with magic, here are our finished crepes. Okay, the traditional and the vegan. All right, you see the light browning around them, but you certainly can tell the difference both in look and texture on these crepes. But it doesn't mean they're not both good, all right? Just a little bit different. So I'm going to turn these off. Now we have some nice brownness to it. And then what I did was I took the crepes and I stuffed them with the compotes that I made. Okay. So again, the traditional crepe here with the beet and spinach, the vegan crepe with the butternut, acorn, squash, cauliflower mixture is in the other pan. Then I have a couple of sauces that I prepared as well, also keeping in mind both vegan and traditional vegetarian dishes. So for my vegan crepe, what I did was I made a Vidalia onion puree. So I took my Vidalia onions, I julienned them up, and I sauteed them to get quite a bit of caramelization and browning in them. I also added a little bit of roasted garlic, some chives, and some red onion to it, and a little red wine. It doesn't hurt to add a little wine, right? And I put that in a food processor and simply pureed it up. Okay? Then back in the pan to heat. The sauce for the traditional crepe is going to be a goat cheese cream. So basically what this is a bechamel sauce, almost, except I didn't use a roux to thicken with it. All right, so I used heavy cream and milk. I reduced that down a little bit, added some flavoring to it, a little salt, pepper, garlic, and I also put in some rosemary and some shallot. And I just let that kind of simmer inside of the cream and milk mixture to pull the flavors out. Then I added some nice share goat cheese to it, and it thickens all on its own. So there's no roux in here, no flour. no other thickening agent. It just thickened up on its own from cooking, reducing the combination of the cheese and the cream. And then I put it through a fine mesh strainer. Something you probably don't have at home. And this is called a chinois often. All right. So you can see the mesh that's on it and how fine that is. So when I want to get every little particle out of the sauce and only have a nice smooth finished texture, this is the type of strainer that I would use. Okay, so if you see our goat cheese sauce here, sorry, share of cheese, not goat cheese. And I'm just going to add some of that to the top. And I'm going to pop that in one of our ovens. Okay. About 400 degrees, 425. And it's only going to take a couple of minutes. The only thing that we're doing there is reheating everything, because remember we made the compote. The compote has been completely cooked through. The crepes obviously are cooked. So all we're doing is putting a little heat on it, kind of melding the flavors together. I'm going to take my Vidalia onion puree and do the same thing there. Just add a little bit to the tops of my crepes. I did spray the pans with a little food release pan spray to keep them from sticking. If you want to rub butter on there, you could always rub some butter in it as well. Going to go in the same oven for about 5 to 10 minutes at the most. That's all it really takes. Again, everything has already been cooked through, so we're just heating it back up and kind of melding those flavors. So we're going to take those crepes away. So as we're letting our crepes finish in the oven, again, only a couple of minutes, we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience. If anybody here would like to ask any questions relating to what we've done today. Or maybe we don't have any questions, or maybe everybody's just a little shy. If you want, you can just want to step up over so so everybody can hear you through the back. Yeah, sorry. The T marks the spot.
Okay, so my question is, when you made the compote, how do you do that?
Again, I'm taking these ingredients here. So I have my cauliflower, I have my acorn butternut squash, and I have my eggplant. And what I did was I took the skins off. In the case of the eggplant, just diced it up. Cauliflower, just cut it up into small pieces. With the acorn and butternut squash, I roasted it in the oven first a little bit. And then I took the skins off. And then I put everything together in a saute pan and just cooked them together and let it meld. So I started with the cauliflower because that's the firmest. Then I added the eggplant, and then the butternut acorn squash last because it was already roasted.
Okay, and so you just did you saute it in butter or oil if you're doing the vegan
Right,
option?
If you're doing it vegan, you're going to go with the soybean oil or even olive oil. If you're not worried about being vegan, butter, you can use that a little bit. If you want to add, a flavoring to that as well. If you want to put a little chicken stock, if you're not worried about, meat or not meat. If you want to add a little vegetarian stock, if you are, you could do that. I didn't in this case.
So you didn't add any extra liquid to either of them?
Just a tad of water, but yeah, that's about it. Again, you're getting a lot of moisture, especially from the squashes themselves because I roasted that first. And I don't want it overly, as you can see the texture on this one, you don't really want it runny because it's going to be inside of that crepe. So when you cut into it, you want it to kind of hold its form a little bit. So we don't want it super runny like a relish or something like that. Okay. So by not adding too much.
If you were preparing these, can you make that compote a day ahead of time and then use it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. In some cases, it even gets a little bit better because the flavors have had a chance to sit and meld. So you put that in the refrigerator, and then you take it back out, heat it up, put it into your crepe, and you're ready to go. So yeah, these hold very well, several days.
Okay.
You know, you get 2-3 days at least from something like that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I love beets, and both kinds, golden and red. The red, though, dealing with those lovely little beet stains, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, beets. I mean, even the golden beets, you know,
Yeah.
put off some color. You know, in history, over time, people have used it as dyes and tattoos and things like that. So wearing gloves, you know, food preparation gloves, vinyl, hopefully not latex. You wear the gloves, and that prevents it from getting on your hands.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, 'cause,
And if you're using a cutting board like this, they tend to, you know, kind of resist the stain as well, as long as you soak them right away and, you know, and get it off of there. So not usually a problem. I did cook the beets separately for that reason, because if you
Okay.
put them together, then it kind of takes away from the color, and it doesn't, you know, even
Yeah,
here
'cause
once
that's beautiful.
I mixed them, it was nice and separated at first, but as it sat here for a little bit, the color is even starting to bleed through now. So yeah, I cooked them separately on purpose, because that'll tend to happen. And you don't want to put anything else in the pot with them, because it's going to
It'd be red.
dye everything else as well. Yeah,
Okay.
certainly.
Oh, lovely.
But beets are, you know,
They're
extremely
good for
healthy.
you. Yeah.
One of the superfoods before we called things superfoods.
Okay, thank you.
All right, anybody else have any questions out there? No? All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for today's first installment of Cooking with Chef Don. Hopefully you learned a few tips and had your palate kind of excited here, and maybe you're going to try this for yourself. It's not that difficult. Most people can get this done with a couple of tries. You'll get it perfect. Again, the crepes themselves, it's just a matter of getting that heat in the pan just right, making sure you're following the recipes for the crepe batter itself, so that it has the right texture to begin with, the right consistency. But it certainly is something you should be able to do at home. And if you don't like beets and you want to use different vegetables, the great thing about compotes, you can use whatever you want, whatever you have fresh, whatever seasonal, whatever you like the most, and put it inside of that crepe. I'm going to pull our pan out of the oven and show it to you before we end here. And then those of you that are live with us are going to get to sample that. So you can see that nice bubbling pan there with our goat cheese, share of goat cheese sauce, and then our Vidalia onion on our vegan crepe. So again, that's going to do it for this installment. We'll be back soon doing another fun recipe for everyone to try at home. And if you want to come and join us here in the studio, keep your eye open. We'll be advertising in the daily and through Campus House, and we'd be glad to have you come down.